So I'm excited for the word that is coming today. It's just one verse. This week, Sonia and I were reading through the book of Hebrews. And as we got to the book of Hebrews, one verse stood out. And so this sermon today is called, If You Only Knew. If you only knew. Sometimes we meet people and we have no idea who they are. I remember getting a phone call from someone that said they had arrived at the airport in the city I was living at that time. I was living overseas, and they said they were given my phone number from a pastor friend. And so they said, we'd love to meet up for dinner. And I said, okay, we'll meet up for dinner. But where they were staying was on the other side of town, and it was just kind of a pain to get to them. So I said, can you get in a taxi? And yes, of course, they're in a foreign country, but I just said, you get in a taxi, get to this spot, and then I'll come meet you. And so I kind of met with them, went out to dinner, and didn't really know why I was meeting with them other than they were another pastor. And I can remember having this conversation with them, and they were asking me about my church. And then I asked them, can you share about your church? How many members? And or I don't think I even asked him how many members, but I just said, share about your church. And he said, oh, I can remember, he said, we have over 20,000 people in our church, all these different campuses. And he started going on about the ministries. And I thought, wow, this pastor must be really well known. But I had no idea and no clue who he was at all. There was no special treatment at all. There was nothing kind of giving him any special attention at all. And I was just treating him like, any ordinary person. Really, in God's eyes, we are all his children, but there's no special attention because I had no idea who he was. Maybe he was expecting me to go out in the other side of town and pick him up, but I didn't do that. I had no idea who he was. And even after he left, his name, kind of forgot about who he was. Now, in other people's eyes, if they attended his church or they were part of the ministries that he was a part of, they would have known exactly who he was. They would have given special attention to him because they would have known the name. They would have known about who he was. And today we're going to take a look in Hebrews chapter 11 because there's some names mentioned that as I was reading them this week, I didn't really know who they were. And sometimes, we can feel that way about ourselves, that we feel like, does God really know who we are? Does God really know about us? And today I felt this message today is for you because God knows you. And if we only knew how God sees us, and if we only knew God's plans for us, we'd be so excited. We'd be so ecstatic because oftentimes we look upon our lives and we're not excited about our lives because we're looking at our lives through our eyes, through the way we see them. And if we only knew the way God sees us and the plans that God has for us, we'd get really excited. So I want to read to you this one verse from Hebrews chapter 11. This is after the writer mentions all these wonderful men and women of God that did miraculous things, wonderful things. He gets to Hebrews 11:32. Says this, and what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, about David and Samuel, and the prophets. He says, I could go on in another translation and talking about all these great men of God, women of God, all the prophets. He said, I don't have time, but he just mentioned their names. And as he mentioned the names, some of the names jump out right away. Samuel. If you remember some of these stories, Samuel that heard God's voice at a young age. David and Goliath. Even those that have never set foot in a church before, if you mention David and Goliath, they'll know what it is. They'll know that there's certain matchups, so related to sports. This is a David and Goliath type of situation. Is they'll mention different people. Gideon, that went before the armies, thousands of people. He had such a small army, but he trusted God. But then there's some names there that I really didn't know who. Barak, kind of heard that name before. Jephthah, for sure. Probably read that story before, but I thought, who is he? If you asked me to recall his name and his story, I had no idea whatsoever is going on in his life. No idea what was happening in his life. And just a mention of his name there. So I started to go and look at these names. Started to look at Jephthah. Went and read the story. And as I read the story, I thought, why is this name there? That's the first thought that came to my mind. Because there's parts of his life and parts of his story that, in my opinion, I feel don't belong here. In my opinion, in my thoughts, I'm like, what could we erase certain parts of his life? There's certain parts that the Bible includes that are real messy, and we wonder, why does God put them there? Why does God include them there? This week I read an autobiography, or it was a biography about Lauren Cunningham, founder of YWAM. as I read through it, just miraculous stories about his life. So many stories. Now, I'm sure there was things that he did wrong, mistakes he made, but they weren't mentioned in full color in this biography. They weren't mentioned there. There was one time that he mentioned that he had pride in his life and God kind of took something away. But there wasn't a lot of things that was mentioned there. It was just all good things, all wonderful things about his life, miraculous stories. That's sometimes the way that we would like our stories to be written. But we know when we look at our life, there's messy things. And sometimes the mistakes we've made, the big things, they come glaring out just like they do in the Bible. Just like when we look at David's life and we think of the adultery and the murder he had. We think of Jephthah, the vow he made when you read his story, and that he said, the first thing that comes out of my house, that's what I'm going to sacrifice. When he got home, it's his daughter coming out. You wonder, like, how could that be included in the Bible? How can that be included in the story? And then, once again, his name being mentioned here. It's because when we look at our lives, we look at our lives through the biggest mistakes we've made. We look through the mistakes and the life that we have, and we look through the regrets we have. We wonder about, God, how can you use me? And we discount ourselves. We take ourselves out of the story. We take ourselves and we write ourselves out. Just like if we were to kind of write this story, we would put a much more sanitized, clean version in. But God doesn't do it. He puts these stories in. He puts these people in here, puts their names here. And he says, like, yeah, you can go and look at their stories. There's messy things in there. There's things that, yeah, you wish weren't there. There's probably things that God, didn't want there in their life at all. But he still puts them there. And he calls them men of faith. He puts them here in this Hall of Faith chapter and calls them men of faith, despite their mistakes. Barak that said, I don't want to go and face the armies unless, Deborah, you come with me. These rash vows, these crazy vows that were made. David, the mistakes he made when he should have known better, is that we look at those and we say, well, that's how God must look at my life, but through those lens of that biggest mistake. But God writes down and he says, no, that they're man of faith. They're man of faith. Is that when we come and we have a relationship with God, is that God is able to take our life. He's able to take the messy parts, those parts that we say, well, I messed up, so I guess I can't be used anymore. He takes those and he still writes our story. He still takes us and he says, that's a man of faith. That's a woman of faith. The enemy takes our life and gets us to look at the mistakes we made, the regrets we have, and say that's what's going to dictate your life. That's the story that's going to be remembered. But if we only knew the way that God sees us, Jephthah probably looked at his life and thought, look at this big mistakes I made. Look at all the mistakes I made. David probably looked at and regretted all the mistakes he made. But history, and when God looked at him, said, no, you're a man of faith. And I felt like this year, when we look at our life this year, the enemy's trying to get us to look at the mistakes we made, look at our past, look at things that we've done, and just get us into a state where we feel like we are not worth anything. And yet God is looking upon our life today, and he's calling you out today and saying that you are a person of faith today, is to rise up and to continue on our path. Look at this right after he mentions these names here in Hebrews chapter 12, what he says. It says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, the great cloud of witnesses, all these people that were mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, not on our mistakes, not on our regrets, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Jesus went to the cross for our mistakes. He went to the cross and paid the price so that we would no longer have to live in the shame and the guilt of our past and our present mistakes, but that we can look to our future and say, I'm going to be a man of faith. I'm going to be a woman of faith. And he says, fix your eyes on Jesus. He says, and get rid of that stuff that entangles you, the sin that entangles you. I was reading this story when I was reading about Lauren Cunningham, and he told this miraculous story about one of the first missions that they were on, is they had been given this dump truck to take supplies out. And so they got in that truck, and when the team leaders, as they were going down the hill, the brakes failed. And they thought their life was over going down this steep hill. And these vines came and just entangled the axle of the truck and just miraculously stopped the truck there. They just said that was such a miracle that, these vines could entangle this huge truck and stop it. And they saw God protecting them. They saw the hand of God over their life. I thought about this as that this is a picture here, but in the opposite here where he talks about sin entangling us. Sin will entangle us and hold us back from moving forward to the will of God. The sin, but it can also be lies of the enemy. It can also be the deceitfulness of the enemy. And so I want to encourage us today is that these names that are mentioned here, that we don't know much about them, we just have their names mentioned here, is that as we go back and we read their stories, we're like, wow, some of these lives are so messy. Is that we may look at our life and say, God, our life is so messy. We might look at our life and say, God, I made so many mistakes. But God sees us through different eyes. And if we only knew, if we could only see the way that God sees us, if we could only know the plans and the purposes God has for us, we'd be able to leave all that shame, all that guilt behind. And so one of the keys that gives us here is to fix our eyes on Jesus. Not on our past, not on our problems, not on even what we think our future is through our eyes, but to fix our eyes on Jesus and say, Jesus, you're going to perfect my faith, Jesus. You're going to lead me. And so I pray today for us. I pray today that our eyes would be concentrated on Jesus. God, I pray today, God, the sin that so easily entangles us, the lies of the enemy, God, I pray that you'd wipe that off from our focus today. I pray, Lord, that just like when we put, Lord, a pin in a GPS map and that just directs us right there and we can zoom in on our destination. Our destination is you, God. And so I pray today, Lord, that you would take our life, God, and you would use it for your glory, God. And we'd receive the words that you're speaking over us today. That we are people of faith, God. We're people of faith. So we take off every lie of the enemy today, God. We take off every plan of the enemy today. And God, we say that your plans and your purposes are our future. In Jesus' name, amen.